Daniel's mother stood frozen in the middle of the grand dining hall, her voice barely above a whisper as she stared at the quiet young woman sitting across the table. "I'm so sorry," she said slowly. "We had no idea who you really were." Emily Carter placed her napkin gently on the table and gave a calm, polite smile. "That's exactly the point," she replied. "Just a few hours earlier, everyone in this room had believed she was a poor, naive girl who didn't belong anywhere near their powerful billionaire family. They laughed quietly at her simple dress. They whispered about her background. They even offered her a charity job out of pity. But what none of them knew was that the woman they had been quietly humiliating was worth more than the entire Whitmore family fortune combined. And tonight, they were about to find out. But before we continue, welcome to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson, a place where we share powerful stories about love, life lessons, and the choices that shape our future. If you're new here, make sure you subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story that could change the way you see the world. And to everyone who keeps coming back, thank you for being part of this growing family. Now, let me ask you something. Have you ever been underestimated because of how you looked? Have people ever judged you before they knew your story? Maybe they assumed you weren't successful enough. Maybe they thought you didn't belong in certain places. Or maybe they believed they were better than you, simply because of money or status. If that has ever happened to you, then this story will feel very familiar. Because Emily Carter understood something that many people learn too late in life. Sometimes the most powerful way to understand someone's character is to let them believe you have nothing. And that was exactly the test Emily decided to run. Because before marrying Daniel Whitmore, the heir to one of the most powerful billionaire families in America, she needed to know something important. She needed to know what kind of people she was about to join. So when Daniel invited her to meet his parents for the first time, Emily made a decision that almost seemed ridiculous. She returned the expensive dress she had bought for the occasion. She wore the simplest outfit she owned. And when she walked into the Whitmore family mansion that evening, she acted like a girl who had never seen real wealth before. She asked innocent questions. She apologized when she used the wrong fork. She spoke about her job as if it was small and unimportant. And slowly, exactly as she expected, the Whitmore family began revealing who they truly were. What they didn't realize was that Emily wasn't nervous, she wasn't embarrassed, and she definitely wasn't poor. In fact, the quiet woman they were judging at that dinner table was the founder of a company worth billions of dollars. A company that had quietly reshaped housing developments across the country. A company that, ironically, had once rejected a partnership proposal from the Whitmore family's own investment firm. But Emily wasn't interested in humiliating anyone. She wasn't there to prove a point. She was there for something much more important. She was there to find out whether the man she loved came from a family that valued character, or a family that only respected power. And by the end of that dinner, everyone in the Whitmore mansion would realize something they never expected. The quiet woman they underestimated was the most powerful person in the room. So if you're ready to discover how one simple decision revealed the true character of an entire billionaire family, then stay with me, because this story begins with a moment that almost didn't happen. A moment so small, Emily nearly ignored it completely. Emily Carter almost didn't step back into the boutique. She had already walked past the glass doors once, telling herself the dress wasn't necessary. The navy dress she wore now was clean, modest, and perfectly appropriate for dinner. It was the kind of dress she had worn to church with her parents growing up, the kind that didn't try too hard to be noticed. Still, she slowed down as she passed the boutique window. Inside, soft golden lights illuminated a row of elegant dresses, silk fabrics draped perfectly on tall mannequins. One of them, a pale champagne-colored evening dress, had caught her attention days earlier. She had even tried it on. For a moment, she remembered how the fabric felt, light, expensive, and perfectly fitted. When she looked at herself in the mirror that day, she had almost convinced herself it was necessary. Necessary to meet the Whitmore family. Necessary to look like she belonged in their world. But standing outside the boutique again, Emily felt something else rising quietly inside her. A memory. Her father's voice. He used to say something whenever people in their small town tried to show off their wealth. "Emily," he would tell her gently, "never change who you are just to make someone else comfortable with your success." Her father had been a high school history teacher. Her mother taught literature at the same school. They had never been wealthy, but they believed deeply in dignity, education, and humility. Emily had grown up in a modest home filled with books, late-night discussions about ethics, and a quiet belief that character mattered more than appearances. And that belief had shaped every major decision she made in life. She stared at the boutique window for another moment, then she turned around. Inside the store, the same saleswoman recognized her immediately. "Oh, welcome back," the woman said warmly. "Are you ready to take the dress home?" Emily hesitated for only a second, before reaching into her purse and placing the folded receipt on the counter. "I'm actually here to return it." The saleswoman looked surprised. Return it, but you loved it. Emily smiled politely. I did, she admitted. But I realized something. What's that? That if I need a dress like that just to feel confident walking into a room, then I'm probably walking into the wrong room. The saleswoman studied her face for a moment, then slowly nodded. I suppose that's one way to look at it. Emily accepted the refund receipt, thanked her, and stepped back out onto the sidewalk. The cool afternoon air brushed lightly against her face. She felt strangely calm. What she didn't realize was that this tiny decision, returning one expensive dress, would quietly shape everything that happened later that evening, because the Whitmore family would notice her simplicity immediately, and they would misunderstand it completely. Across the city, Daniel Whitmore leaned back in his office chair, staring at the engagement ring box on his desk. He had looked at it at least 20 times that day, not because he doubted Emily, but because he knew what came next, meeting his family. Daniel Whitmore was 34 years old and one of the youngest CEOs in the country. His father's investment empire had been built over 3 decades, expanding into real estate, technology, and global finance. The Whitmore name carried influence in boardrooms across the country. But inside the family itself, influence often came with expectations. Daniel had dated before, several times actually, and every relationship had ended the same way, after the woman met his parents. Not because his parents openly disapproved. They were always polite, always charming, always gracious. But Daniel knew them well enough to see the subtle signals, the quiet questions about family background, the curiosity about career ambitions, the careful way they measured whether someone belonged within the Whitmore world. Most women tried very hard to impress them. Emily never tried at all, and that was exactly why Daniel fell in love with her. He still remembered the first day they met. It wasn't at a glamorous party. It wasn't at a business conference. It happened at a half-finished housing development on the edge of the city. Daniel had been volunteering there on weekends, helping coordinate a community housing program funded quietly by his company. He rarely told anyone about his family during those visits. For once, he wanted to be treated like a normal person. Emily had been organizing volunteers that day, her hair tied loosely back, a clipboard in one hand, and an expression of calm focus that somehow kept dozens of chaotic volunteers moving efficiently. Daniel had approached her to ask where supplies were stored. Instead, she handed him a stack of boxes and said, "Apartment 3 needs these upstairs." He laughed. "You don't even know who I am." She glanced at him briefly. "You're someone with 2 working arms," she replied. Upstairs, Daniel carried the boxes, and somehow that simple moment turned into a long conversation. Then another, then dinner. 3 months passed before Daniel finally told her the truth about his family. He had expected shock, curiosity, maybe excitement. Instead, Emily simply nodded thoughtfully. "That explains your watch," she said. Daniel looked down at his wrist. "Was it that obvious?" "No," she replied calmly. "But you never look worried about money." That honesty stayed with him. Most people treated wealth like a prize. Emily treated it like a detail, something that mattered, but not more than character. That difference was the reason he bought the engagement ring now sitting on his desk. But tonight was the first step before proposing. Dinner with his parents, and he had no idea how it would go. Later that evening, Daniel pulled his car into Emily's apartment complex. It was a modest building on a quiet street lined with tall maple trees, the kind of neighborhood where people still greeted each other in the hallway. Emily stepped outside just as Daniel walked toward the entrance. She wore the navy dress he had seen many times before. Simple, elegant, in a quiet way, but not remotely the kind of outfit most people would wear to meet a billionaire family. Daniel paused slightly. "I thought you bought a new dress for tonight." Emily shrugged gently. "I changed my mind." "Why?" She smiled, locking her apartment door behind her. "Because I want your family to meet the real me." Daniel studied her for a moment. There was something thoughtful in her eyes tonight, something deliberate, but he trusted her, and more importantly, he respected her independence. "Fair enough," he said, opening the car door. As they drove toward the Whitmore estate, the city lights slowly faded behind them. Large homes began appearing along the winding hillside roads, then larger ones. Eventually the gates of the Whitmore property came into view, tall iron bars framed by stone pillars and security cameras. Emily watched quietly as the gates opened. The long driveway curved past manicured gardens, a marble fountain, and rows of towering oak trees. Daniel glanced at her. "Nervous?" Emily smiled slightly. "Not really." But what she didn't say was this. She wasn't nervous, because tonight wasn't a test for her. It was a test for them. And before she married Daniel Whitmore, Emily Carter intended to learn exactly what kind of family she was about to join. The car rolled slowly toward the grand mansion. Inside that house, first impressions would form quickly. Judgments would be made, and long-held assumptions would soon begin to unravel, because the quiet woman stepping out of Daniel Whitmore's car that night was not who the Whitmore family believed she was, not even close. The Whitmore mansion looked less like a house and more like a statement. Tall stone columns framed the entrance. Warm golden lights illuminated the long marble staircase, leading up to enormous double doors. Beyond the wide front lawn, the city lights shimmered faintly in the distance, making the estate appear like a world of its own, separate from everything else. Daniel parked the car near the front steps and turned off the engine. For a moment, neither of them moved. Emily studied the house quietly. She had seen photographs before, but standing here in person made the scale of it impossible to ignore. "This place could fit my entire apartment building inside," she said softly. Daniel smiled faintly. "Probably." She turned to him. "Did you grow up here?" "Most of my life," he said. "My father bought the property when I was 12. Emily nodded slowly, taking that information in. A childhood spent in a house like this was very different from the one she had known. Her parents' home had been small but filled with laughter, books and long conversations at the kitchen table. The Whitmore mansion, by contrast, looked almost too perfect, too polished to feel lived in. Daniel opened his door. "Ready?" Emily took a slow breath and stepped out of the car. "Yes." They walked toward the entrance together. The doors opened before they could knock. A tall man in a dark suit greeted them with a polite nod. "Good evening, Mr. Whitmore." "Thanks, Henry," Daniel said. Henry's eyes briefly moved toward Emily, assessing her in the calm, professional way of someone used to observing people carefully. "Good evening, miss." "Good evening," Emily replied politely. Inside, the mansion felt even larger. High ceilings stretched upward, decorated with detailed molding. Crystal chandeliers reflected warm light across polished marble floors. Paintings lined the walls, large historic pieces that looked as if they belonged in museums rather than hallways. Emily walked beside Daniel, her expression calm, but she noticed everything. The quiet footsteps of staff moving discreetly through side corridors. The careful arrangement of furniture. The way the house seemed designed not just for comfort, but for influence. Eventually they reached a large sitting room. Two people stood near the fireplace. Daniel's parents. His mother, Margaret Whitmore, was the first to step forward. She was elegant in a quiet, controlled way. Her silver blonde hair was styled perfectly, and her dark green dress carried the understated sophistication of someone who had spent decades attending high-level social events. Her smile appeared warm, but her eyes were already studying Emily carefully. "Daniel," she said, embracing her son lightly. Then she turned. "And this must be Emily." Emily extended her hand politely. "It's very nice to meet you, Mrs. Whitmore." Margaret shook her hand gently. "Please, call me Margaret." But even as she spoke, Emily noticed the quick glance Margaret gave her dress. Simple, modest, not designer. The evaluation lasted less than 2 seconds. But it happened. Daniel's father, Charles Whitmore, approached next. Unlike his wife, Charles carried a more relaxed presence. His grey hair and calm posture gave him the quiet authority of a man used to making decisions that moved millions of dollars. "Emily," he said warmly, shaking her hand. "Welcome to our home." "Thank you for having me," she replied. For a moment, the room was filled with polite conversation. Then Margaret gestured toward the dining room. "Dinner is ready." The Whitmore dining room looked like something from another century. A long, polished table stretched across the center of the room, set with delicate silverware and crystal glasses. Tall windows overlooked the dark gardens outside, and soft candlelight created an atmosphere of formal elegance. Emily took her seat beside Daniel. Margaret sat at the head of the table, Charles at the other end. Staff members quietly served the first course. The conversation began politely enough. Margaret asked about Emily's work. "So Daniel tells us you're involved in housing projects." Emily nodded. "Yes. I work with community housing development programs." Margaret tilted her head slightly. "That sounds meaningful." The pause before the word meaningful was subtle, but it carried a certain implication. Emily noticed it immediately. "Yes," she said gently. "I enjoy helping communities improve their living conditions." Charles leaned forward slightly. "And how long have you been doing that?" "About 8 years." Margaret took a sip of her wine. "And does that kind of work provide stable income?" Daniel shifted slightly in his chair, but Emily answered calmly. "It provides enough." Margaret smiled politely. "I see." For the next several minutes, the conversation continued in a similar tone. Margaret asked questions about Emily's education, her parents, her childhood. Each question was phrased politely, but beneath the surface, Emily could sense what Margaret was trying to determine: where she came from, what level of society she belonged to, and most importantly, whether she fit into the Whitmore world. At one point, Emily accidentally picked up the wrong fork. She paused, and gave a small, embarrassed smile. "Oh, I'm sorry," she said softly. "I always forget which one to use first." Margaret exchanged a quick glance with Charles. Daniel noticed. Emily noticed too. But she continued playing the role she had chosen carefully. The modest girl, the slightly naive outsider. And slowly, something predictable began happening. The more Emily appeared simple, the more relaxed Margaret became. Because in Margaret's mind, she had already drawn a conclusion. This young woman clearly wasn't from a powerful background. And that meant something important. She could be evaluated, measured, possibly even guided. Toward the end of dinner, Margaret leaned slightly toward Emily. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "our family foundation operates several charitable housing programs." Emily looked interested. "That sounds wonderful." Margaret nodded. "We often look for passionate individuals to assist with community outreach." Daniel immediately understood where the conversation was heading. His mother continued, "If you're interested, Emily, we might be able to find you a position within the foundation." The offer sounded generous, but Daniel knew the tone behind it, a polite way of offering help, because they assumed Emily needed it. Emily looked pleasantly surprised. "That's very kind of you." Margaret smiled. "We like to support people who are dedicated." For a moment, silence settled over the table. Daniel watched Emily carefully. He expected her to feel uncomfortable, maybe even offended. But instead, Emily simply nodded politely. "Thank you," she said. "I'll certainly think about it." Across the table, Charles studied her quietly. Something about her calmness intrigued him. Most people reacted differently in situations like this, but Emily seemed completely at ease, as if she were observing the entire evening from a distance. Dinner continued for another 20 minutes. Eventually, coffee was served in the sitting room. Daniel stepped outside briefly to take a phone call from one of his company executives, leaving Emily alone with his parents. Margaret waited until the door closed before speaking again. She folded her hands neatly in her lap. "Emily," she said carefully. "Yes?" Margaret's voice remained polite, but the directness behind it was impossible to miss. "You seem like a very kind young woman." Emily smiled. "Thank you," Margaret continued. "But Daniel's life is complicated." Charles remained silent, watching the conversation unfold. Margaret leaned slightly forward. "Our family operates in circles where certain expectations exist." Emily nodded slowly. "I understand." Margaret studied her expression. "And do you truly believe you're prepared for that kind of life?" The question hung quietly in the air. It wasn't cruel, but it was very clear. Margaret believed Emily didn't belong in their world. Emily lowered her eyes thoughtfully. Then she looked back up with a gentle smile. "That's a fair question." Charles raised an eyebrow slightly. Margaret waited. Emily continued softly. "I suppose the real question isn't whether I'm prepared for your world." Margaret frowned slightly. Emily's voice remained calm. "It's whether your world is prepared for me." For the first time that evening, Charles Whitmore leaned forward with genuine curiosity, because suddenly, he wasn't so sure they understood this young woman sitting in their living room at all. "Before we move into the next chapter of this story, I want to ask you something. If you were sitting at that dinner table, and someone judged you just because of the way you dressed or where you came from, how would you react? Would you defend yourself immediately? Or would you stay quiet and let them reveal their true character first? Tell me your answer in the comments. I read them all, and I love seeing the different perspectives from this amazing community. And if you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to like the video, share it with someone who loves powerful life lessons, and subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson so you never miss another story that reminds us why character will always matter more than money. Now, let's continue the story. Daniel stepped outside onto the stone terrace, the cool night air brushing lightly against his face as he answered the phone. "Yes, I saw the report," he said quietly. "Move the meeting to tomorrow morning. I'll review everything before 9. He listened for a moment, gave a short response, and ended the call. For a few seconds he stood there looking out across the dark gardens. The Whitmore estate stretched far beyond what most people could see from the house. Rolling lawns, tall trees, and long stone paths illuminated by subtle garden lights. Normally this view calmed him. Tonight, his thoughts were somewhere else. Inside the house. With Emily, Daniel trusted her completely, but he also knew his parents well enough to recognize when they were quietly forming judgments. He exhaled slowly and leaned against the railing. Then, almost without meaning to, his mind drifted back to the first day he met her. Because the truth was, Emily Carter had surprised him from the very beginning. 2 years earlier, the construction site looked chaotic. Stacks of lumber sat beside unfinished apartment units. Volunteers carried paint buckets up narrow staircases, while the distant sound of power tools echoed across the partially completed buildings. Daniel had arrived wearing jeans and a simple jacket. No expensive watch. No company car. Just another volunteer. The housing project had been quietly funded by one of the Whitmore investment divisions, but Daniel rarely told people that. When he volunteered on weekends, he preferred to be treated like everyone else. He stepped inside one of the half-finished buildings and looked around. Someone was organizing the volunteers near a folding table covered with paperwork and blueprints. That was the first time he saw her. Emily stood behind the table with a clipboard, speaking calmly to a group of volunteers who looked slightly overwhelmed. Apartment 3 still needs drywall installed, she explained. And the kitchen units in Apartment 5 need help carrying supplies upstairs. Her voice wasn't loud, but somehow everyone listened. Daniel waited until the group dispersed before approaching the table. "Excuse me," he said. Emily glanced up briefly. "Yes? I'm new here," he said. "Where should I start?" Without hesitation, she reached beside the table and handed him 2 heavy boxes. "Third floor," she said. Daniel blinked. "That's it." Emily raised an eyebrow slightly. "Do you need a speech?" He laughed. "No." "Good," she replied calmly. Apartment 3. Daniel carried the boxes upstairs. By the time he returned, Emily was reorganizing a pile of paperwork. "You're efficient," he said. "Someone has to be," she replied. "You're the coordinator?" "Volunteer coordinator." Daniel leaned against the table. "How many people are working here today?" Emily flipped through her clipboard. 32 volunteers. "And you manage all of them?" "Yes." Daniel looked around again. Most people at construction sites raised their voices to be heard. Emily didn't. Yet somehow everything moved smoothly. "You're good at this," he said. Emily shrugged. "I like solving problems." That sentence stayed with him. Over the next few hours, Daniel kept finding excuses to return to the supply table. Sometimes to ask questions, sometimes to carry more materials. Eventually, Emily noticed. "You've already carried enough boxes for one day," she said. "I don't mind. You're avoiding something." Daniel laughed. "Am I that obvious?" "A little." He hesitated. Then he asked a question. "Why do you do this?" Emily looked around the construction site before answering. "Because housing changes everything." Daniel waited. She continued. "When families have stable homes, kids do better in school. Parents keep steady jobs. Communities improve." She tapped the clipboard gently. "People think buildings solve problems. But really, stability solves problems." Daniel nodded slowly. That answer sounded nothing like the typical responses he heard from people involved in development projects. Most talked about profits, growth, expansion. Emily talked about people. Later that afternoon, they ended up sitting on the unfinished balcony of one of the apartment units, sharing 2 cups of coffee from a nearby cafe. Daniel looked out over the neighborhood. "You've been doing this for a long time?" he asked. 8 years. "You must really believe in it." Emily smiled faintly. "My parents were teachers. They believed if you improve living conditions, you improve education too." Daniel considered that. "My father believes real estate is the most reliable investment in the world." Emily glanced at him. "He's not wrong." Daniel laughed. "You didn't ask what my father does." Emily shrugged. "I didn't think it mattered." That moment was when Daniel realized something important. Emily wasn't trying to impress him. She wasn't curious about his connections. She wasn't calculating what his background could offer her. She was simply herself, honest, focused, grounded, and that honesty made him want to keep talking to her. Back on the Whitmore terrace, Daniel smiled slightly at the memory. 2 years had passed since that first conversation. 2 years of late-night discussions, weekend volunteer projects, and countless quiet moments where Emily showed him the kind of character that money couldn't buy. That was why he loved her. But tonight was different. Tonight, she was meeting the Whitmore family, and even Daniel couldn't fully predict how that would unfold. He pushed himself away from the railing and walked back toward the house. Inside, in the sitting room, a very different conversation was already beginning. Margaret Whitmore folded her hands neatly in her lap as she studied Emily across the coffee table. Charles remained seated beside the fireplace, quietly observing. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Then Margaret finally broke the silence. "Emily," she said politely. "Yes?" Margaret's voice remained calm. "But I would like to understand something." Emily waited. Margaret continued. "You seem like a thoughtful young woman." "Thank you. But Daniel's life involves certain responsibilities." Emily nodded. "I can imagine." Margaret leaned slightly forward. "And yet you appear very comfortable with simplicity." Emily smiled gently. "I am." Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly in curiosity. "You don't seem interested in wealth." Emily considered the question carefully. Then she answered honestly. "Wealth is useful." Charles lifted an eyebrow. "But," Emily looked around the elegant room. "But it doesn't impress me very much." For the first time that evening, Charles Whitmore chuckled softly, because suddenly, The quiet young woman sitting across from them seemed far more interesting than he originally assumed. Daniel stepped back into the house, closing the terrace door quietly behind him. The warm glow of the sitting room lights stretched across the polished floor. Emily was still seated on the sofa, her posture relaxed, her hands folded loosely in her lap. His parents sat across from her. From a distance, the conversation looked calm, but Daniel knew the subtle signals in his parents' body language. His mother's head tilted slightly in that analytical way she had whenever she was studying someone. His father leaned back with the thoughtful expression he reserved for negotiations. Emily, on the other hand, looked perfectly at ease. Daniel crossed the room. "Sorry about that," he said. "Work never seems to stop." Margaret gave a polite smile. "We were just having a conversation." Daniel glanced briefly at Emily. "How bad was it?" Emily smiled faintly. "Your parents are very thorough." Charles chuckled quietly. "That's one way to describe us." Margaret gestured toward the coffee tray. "Would anyone like more coffee?" Daniel declined, but Emily accepted another cup. As one of the house staff quietly poured it, Margaret turned her attention back to Daniel. "So," she said calmly, "how exactly did the two of you meet?" Daniel leaned back slightly. "At a housing development project." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Really?" Emily nodded. "We were both volunteering." Margaret's expression revealed mild surprise. "Daniel volunteering on a construction site," she said, almost amused. "That's something I never expected." Daniel shrugged. "I enjoy it." Charles nodded approvingly. "There's value in understanding the work behind the investments." Emily listened quietly. Margaret looked at her again. "And you organize these volunteer projects?" "Yes." Margaret sipped her coffee. "That sounds like a very demanding job." "It can be." "But you enjoy it?" Emily nodded. "I do." Margaret studied her carefully. "What made you choose that field?" For a moment, Emily seemed thoughtful. Then she answered honestly. "My parents believed that stable housing is one of the foundations of a healthy society." Charles leaned forward slightly. "That's a very academic way of looking at it." Emily smiled. They were both teachers. Margaret exchanged a brief glance with Charles. "Teachers," she repeated softly. Emily nodded. "Yes." Margaret said nothing for a moment. Daniel knew exactly what that silence meant. His mother had just placed Emily into a social category in her mind. Not wealthy, not influential, respectable, but ordinary. Emily seemed completely unaware of the conclusion Margaret had just reached. She continued sipping her coffee calmly. Finally, Charles spoke again. "You've been working in housing development for 8 years, correct?" "Yes." "And do you plan to continue that career long-term?" Emily considered the question. "Yes," she said simply. Daniel noticed the subtle curiosity in his father's expression. Charles Whitmore had spent decades building an empire in real estate investments. Housing development was not unfamiliar territory to him. But Emily spoke about it differently than most professionals he encountered. Not like a business opportunity, like a mission. Margaret leaned forward slightly again. "And Daniel tells us you manage several projects at once." "I try to." "That must require strong organizational skills." Emily smiled politely. "It keeps me busy." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. Then she said something that made Daniel shift slightly in his seat. "Well, if you're ever interested in expanding your professional opportunities, our foundation has many connections in housing initiatives." Emily looked curious. "That's very generous." Margaret smiled. "We enjoy helping promising individuals grow in their careers." Daniel understood the hidden meaning. Margaret believed she was offering Emily a path upward, a way to become more suitable for their family. Emily nodded politely. "I appreciate that." Charles studied her face again. "You seem very calm tonight," he said. Emily glanced at him. "Should I be nervous?" Charles smiled slightly. "Many people are when they visit this house for the first time." Emily looked around the room thoughtfully. "It's a beautiful home." Margaret waited. Emily added softly, "But a house is still just a house." For a moment, silence settled across the room again. Charles smiled. Margaret did not. Daniel looked at Emily with quiet curiosity, because the way she spoke didn't sound naive at all. It sounded deliberate. Eventually, Margaret stood. "Well," she said, smoothing the front of her dress, "it's getting late." She looked toward Daniel. "You're both welcome to stay longer if you like." But the tone suggested something different. The evening was ending. Daniel stood. "We should probably head out." Emily rose as well. "Thank you for dinner." Margaret walked them toward the entrance hall. Charles followed a few steps behind. At the door, Margaret paused. "Emily," she said politely. "Yes?" Margaret's expression softened slightly. "You seem like a very kind person." Emily smiled. "Thank you." Margaret hesitated before continuing. "I hope you understand that families like ours sometimes take time to adjust to new relationships." Emily nodded calmly. I understand. Charles finally spoke from behind them. But sometimes, he added thoughtfully, first impressions can be misleading. Emily glanced at him. I agree. Daniel opened the door. The cool night air drifted inside again. As they stepped outside, Margaret watched them walk toward the car. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she turned to Charles. Well? She asked quietly. Charles looked thoughtful. I'm not sure yet. Margaret frowned slightly. Not sure about... Charles glanced toward the driveway where Daniel and Emily were getting into the car. I'm not sure we understand that young woman at all. Inside the car, Daniel started the engine. He glanced at Emily. You handled that very calmly. Emily smiled faintly. Did the first? Yes. She looked out the window as the mansion slowly disappeared behind them. Well, she said quietly. Tonight was very informative. Daniel frowned slightly. What do you mean? Emily turned toward him. I think your parents told me exactly who they are. Daniel waited. And what did you learn? Emily's smile was calm, but mysterious. I learned that sometimes people reveal their true character when they believe they're speaking to someone with less power than them. Daniel drove in silence for a moment. Then he asked the question that had been on his mind all evening. Emily, why do I feel like you planned tonight? She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked out at the quiet road ahead, because, in truth, the real test hadn't even started yet. The next morning, Daniel arrived at his office with Emily by his side, though the conversation from the previous evening still lingered in both their minds. The Whitmore family wasn't cruel. They simply had a very particular way of measuring people. Status, influence and control had always been central to their identity. Emily watched Daniel move through his office with quiet confidence, organizing schedules, reviewing reports, and speaking briefly to assistants without raising his voice. Despite being a billionaire, Daniel carried the air of someone who treated people with respect. It was this consistency, more than anything, that Emily found reassuring. I know my parents have a reputation, Daniel said quietly, almost as if reading her thoughts. They're thorough, maybe too thorough. Emily smiled. They're human, and every human has habits. Some are easier to notice than others. Daniel laughed softly. You make it sound simple. It's not simple, she admitted. It's observation and patience. He paused, leaning back slightly in his chair. Do you really want to be part of this world? Emily considered the question. She thought of her parents and their small home, the life they had built on honesty and hard work. She thought of the countless families her company had helped, the neighborhoods she had improved. And she thought of Daniel, not as a billionaire, but as a man who shared her values, even if he had grown up in a world that often prized wealth over character. Yes, she said at last. Because it's not about fitting in. It's about staying true to who I am, no matter where I go. Later that week, Emily joined Daniel at one of his family's corporate meetings, not as a participant, but as an observer. She watched the Whitmore executives discuss investments, expansion plans, and strategic acquisitions. The discussions were intense, precise, and full of subtle power dynamics. Emily's knowledge of business, though rooted in her own company, allowed her to follow the conversation easily. She even noted a few opportunities where her insights could have added value, but she kept quiet, letting observation guide her. During the meeting, Daniel leaned slightly toward her and whispered, You see why I respect you so much. Most people in here only think about numbers. You think about people. Emily smiled softly. And you see why I trust you. You don't need everyone to like me. You just need to know the truth. It was a brief exchange, but it reminded both of them why their connection was different. Trust and respect weren't built on grand gestures or dramatic chemistry. They were built on consistency, shared responsibility, and the quiet understanding that each would act with integrity, even when no one was watching. That evening, Daniel invited Emily to dinner again. This time not at the Whitmore mansion, but at a small, cozy Italian restaurant tucked away in the city. No grand chandeliers, no formal staff. Just two people, sharing a meal and conversation. As they sat across from each other, Emily reflected on the previous night's dinner with Daniel's parents. She realized that while appearances had mattered to them, the more significant truths had revealed themselves quietly, through tone, subtle gestures, and the assumptions they made about her. Do you ever think about how small choices shape people? Emily asked between bites of pasta. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Small choices? Like tonight, she said. Or even my decision to return that dress before the dinner. That one simple act, returning a dress, changed the way your family saw me. And in many ways, it revealed more about them than about me. Daniel leaned back, considering her words. So, the dress wasn't about you at all? Emily shook her head. Not really. It was about observation, understanding character, and sometimes the things that seem insignificant, what fork you use, the way you carry yourself, can tell you the most about someone. Daniel reached across the table and took her hand. I've never met anyone like you. Emily smiled, squeezing his hand lightly. And I've never met anyone like you. They shared a quiet moment of connection, both aware that their love was growing not from fireworks or instant chemistry, but from trust, respect, and the deliberate choices they made every day. The next few days brought more subtle tests. Daniel's parents asked about Emily's career achievements, her past projects, and her long-term goals. Each time, Emily responded with honesty and humility. She never boasted, but she never diminished her accomplishments. And with each answer, the Whitmore family began to see that there was more to this quiet young woman than their first impressions had suggested. It wasn't immediate admiration, not yet, but curiosity, and curiosity, Emily knew, was the first step toward respect. By the end of the week, Daniel turned to her with a smile that carried a hint of pride. You handled everything gracefully. My parents may not fully understand you yet, but I think they're beginning to see who you really are. Emily returned the smile. And that's all that matters. Not understanding, just being understood where it counts. As they left the office building and walked toward the car, Emily thought about how far she had come. Small choices, returning a dress, observing quietly, speaking truth with humility, had quietly shaped her path to this moment. And she knew, without a doubt, that every choice she made next would matter just as much. Because love, she realized, wasn't just about grand gestures. It was about consistency, honesty, and the courage to act with integrity, even when the world expected you to act otherwise. The following weekend, Emily agreed to join Daniel at a family luncheon, an informal event meant to blend business with personal interaction. Daniel had warned her the Whitmores were subtle, and every comment, every glance would be measured carefully. Emily had prepared herself, but she didn't anticipate just how revealing the day would be. Arriving at the mansion, Emily noticed a slightly different atmosphere than the formal dinner. Children of distant relatives ran quietly along the hallway. Staff moved efficiently but unobtrusively, and the scent of freshly baked bread mingled with polished wood. The Whitmore estate felt alive in a way it hadn't the night before. Margaret approached Emily first. Emily, good to see you again, she said with a polite nod. I hope you're comfortable. I am, thank you, Emily replied sincerely. She had decided that politeness, combined with calm observation, would serve her better than trying to impress or entertain. She would let the family reveal themselves naturally. As the luncheon began, Daniel introduced Emily to extended family members and close business associates. Polite smiles were exchanged. Emily made small talk, careful to ask questions about people's interests, subtly observing their values and priorities. Every answer, every gesture, told her more than she had expected. At one point, a distant cousin, clearly accustomed to wealth and social hierarchy, made a quiet remark about her modest clothing. Emily noticed Daniel tense ever so slightly beside her. She leaned forward, keeping her voice soft. I prefer comfort over display, she said lightly. I believe who you are is more important than what you wear. A brief silence followed, then the cousin smiled, perhaps surprised, perhaps impressed by her composure. Daniel looked at her, eyes wide with a mixture of admiration and relief. Emily had handled the subtle jab perfectly, not defensively, not angrily, but with clarity that immediately shifted the dynamic of the conversation. The Whitmore family began to sense that Emily's quiet strength was not something to be underestimated. Later, when dessert was served, Charles Whitmore leaned toward Emily. I must admit, Emily, you have a perspective that is different. You don't appear interested in wealth or status, yet your presence commands respect. That is unusual in our circle. Emily smiled politely. Thank you, Mr. Whitmore. I believe people should be measured by character, not by the size of their bank account. Margaret watched quietly from across the table, her expression a mix of curiosity and reflection. Emily's words had been simple, but her confidence carried weight. No one in the family could dismiss her lightly, and that was precisely the point. Daniel reached over, brushing his hand gently against hers under the table, a silent acknowledgement of the subtle victory. Not a showy gesture, not dramatic, just mutual understanding and support. By the end of the luncheon, Emily had not only survived the subtle scrutiny of the Whitmore family, but had begun to carve a place of quiet respect. Every answer she gave, every measured smile, had reinforced her authenticity. And though the Whitmores would take time to fully appreciate her, she had learned a vital truth. Power and influence are often less about what you say, and more about the composure with which you navigate the room. As Daniel escorted her back to the car, he glanced at her with a proud smile. I think tonight went better than I expected. Emily shook her head slightly, a soft smile playing on her lips. It wasn't about impressing them. It was about understanding them and showing them who I really am. Daniel nodded. That's why I fell in love with you. Emily's eyes softened. And I fell in love with you for the same reason. They drove away in silence, the mansion fading behind them, leaving only the quiet realization that the smallest choices, returning a dress, speaking with honesty, observing before acting, had quietly shifted the balance of respect and understanding. And for both of them, it was clear that love, when built on trust and integrity, could withstand even the most exacting scrutiny. The next week, Daniel arranged for Emily to accompany him on a business visit, a rare opportunity for her to see the Whitmore enterprise from a professional perspective. Unlike the formal dinners and social luncheons, this would be work-focused. Emily's heart raced as they entered the gleaming high-rise office building downtown, where polished floors reflected sunlight and glass walls separated conference rooms from open workspaces. Daniel paused briefly in the lobby. "I know this isn't your world," he said, "but I think you'll find the people here interesting." Emily smiled softly. "I'm not here to impress anyone. I'm here to observe, understand, and learn, just like always." His smile lingered a moment. He had learned long ago that Emily's quiet confidence was a force in itself. Unlike many, she didn't try to dominate or prove herself. She simply carried herself with clarity and purpose, and people responded instinctively. The first meeting was with one of the Whitmore family's senior executives, a woman named Vanessa, mid-40s, impeccably dressed, her tone polite but probing. Vanessa had spent decades navigating the intricate web of corporate politics. She asked Emily a few pointed questions about her housing projects, budgets, timelines, and partnerships. Emily answered calmly, demonstrating her knowledge without exaggeration or unnecessary flourish. Daniel watched from across the room, impressed. Emily wasn't just knowledgeable, she exuded a balance of humility and authority that made even the most experienced executives pause and consider her answers seriously. After the meeting, Vanessa pulled Daniel aside. "She's impressive," she said quietly. "Not in a way most people expect. She's grounded, strategic. She's not trying to be one of us, but that's exactly why she commands respect." Daniel nodded, though Emily had already returned to reviewing the meeting notes quietly. That observation from Vanessa reinforced what he had known all along. Emily's authenticity made her more influential than most people with titles and power. Later, during a tour of one of the Whitmore family's urban redevelopment projects, Emily observed the small details others overlooked. Sidewalk placement, drainage systems, landscaping that would affect foot traffic, all of it mattered. She asked questions about project sustainability, community impact, and long-term housing stability. The project manager, accustomed to high-level directives without consultation, initially bristled at Emily's detailed inquiries. But when he realized her knowledge was practical, grounded, and relevant, he began answering in full detail, explaining reasoning and calculations he had never shared with executives before. Daniel noticed the subtle shifts in the team's responses. Emily's presence changed the way people behaved. Respect wasn't demanded, it was earned quietly through competence and integrity. During lunch, they sat on a small outdoor terrace overlooking the site. Emily observed workers moving efficiently, the sunlight catching the steel beams of the under-construction buildings. She sipped her tea, thoughtful. "Emily," Daniel said after a pause, "how do you always know what to say and when?" Emily smiled faintly. "I don't always know. I just watch. People reveal themselves without realizing it, and if you pay attention, you can learn a lot more about them than they learn about you." Daniel considered this. "It's like the dress at the boutique." Emily's smile deepened. "Exactly. Small choices matter. Returning that dress wasn't about vanity, it was about testing how others would react, how the world would perceive me. The same principle applies here, every day." Daniel reached across the table, resting his hand lightly over hers. "You have a gift. Most people would be nervous or insecure in these situations. You navigate them with calm precision." Emily looked down at their hands, then back at him. "I don't think it's a gift. I think it's learned. Experience, patience, paying attention. Those things make you strong without making you loud." The afternoon continued with meetings, site tours, and casual discussions with staff. Emily maintained her composure, demonstrating a mix of technical knowledge, social awareness, and understated confidence. Every observation she made, every question she asked, subtly reinforced her credibility. By the time they returned to Daniel's office, the project managers and executives she had interacted with were genuinely impressed. They discussed her contributions among themselves in hushed tones, commenting not just on her skill, but on the quiet way she influenced others without trying to. Daniel, sitting behind his desk, looked at her and said, "You've already changed the way people here think. And you haven't even tried." Emily leaned back in her chair, contemplative. "I didn't need to try. I only needed to show up as myself." Later that evening, Daniel and Emily returned to her apartment. The city lights glimmered through her modest living room window. Emily unpacked her bag while Daniel poured them both glasses of water. "I think my parents will notice the difference," Daniel said casually. "You've done more to earn respect in one afternoon than many people do in years." Emily shook her head. "Respect isn't something you earn in a single day. It's built slowly through consistency. What happened today is just another step." Daniel smiled. admiration in his eyes. And that's why I love you. You understand that small decisions, the ones most people overlook, shape everything. Emily nodded. Exactly. Love, work, family, life itself. Every choice counts, even the ones that feel insignificant. Over the next few days, Emily received emails from several of the Whitmore executives she had met. Some sought advice, others requested more in-depth conversations about her previous projects. She realized that her consistent honesty, combined with her ability to focus on practical solutions, had created opportunities she hadn't expected. Daniel observed this quietly. You're not just navigating their world, you're improving it, he remarked one evening. Emily's smile was soft. I'm just being consistent. The rest is a consequence of that. Daniel paused, taking her hand. Consistency is rare. Most people either oversell themselves or hide behind appearances. You do neither. That night, as Emily walked Daniel to his car, she reflected on the lessons from the week, the boutique dress, the dinners, the luncheons, the worksite. Every subtle decision, every deliberate choice had created momentum, and momentum, she realized, was the quiet engine behind trust, respect, and love. She looked at Daniel, eyes bright. Sometimes I think the most important victories are invisible. They're the ones no one applauds immediately, but they matter the most in the long run. Daniel nodded slowly. And you've won so many of them quietly, without even trying to be noticed. Emily laughed softly. That's the point. Trying to be noticed usually backfires. But showing up with integrity, that always works. The city skyline shimmered in the night as they said their goodbyes. Emily knew that tomorrow, the Whitmore family would continue to test her patience, subtly challenge her confidence, and measure her worth. And she was ready. Because she had learned that quiet strength, deliberate choices, and consistency could influence even the most powerful people, not with force, but with authenticity. And that lesson, more than any social grace or designer outfit, would carry her through everything to come. The following morning, Daniel called Emily early. I know it's your day off, but my father asked if you could attend a breakfast meeting with him and a few board members, he said. It's informal, but it's important. Emily hesitated briefly, then agreed. All right, I'll come. By the time she arrived, the Whitmore estate's breakfast room was already bustling. Daniel's father, Charles, presided at the long table with several executives seated around him. Margaret Whitmore had prepared a light selection of fruit, pastries, and tea, her expression carefully composed, as if every motion and gesture were a test. Daniel led Emily to a seat beside him. Remember, he said softly, just be yourself. Observing quietly often tells you more than speaking too much. Emily smiled faintly. I know. Consistency and integrity, right? He nodded. Exactly. The breakfast meeting began casually. Discussions ranged from urban development projects to potential investments in community programs. Emily listened carefully, noting the subtle ways influence moved through the room. The conversation shifted to funding allocations for several housing initiatives, a topic she knew intimately. When one executive made a dismissive comment about the feasibility of integrating sustainable materials, Emily spoke up calmly. If we reconsider how we source materials, we could reduce costs without sacrificing quality. Additionally, it could have a measurable positive impact on the community and long-term maintenance. The room fell silent for a brief moment. Then Charles Whitmore leaned forward, eyebrows raised. Explain your proposal further, Emily. Emily detailed her approach clearly, focusing on practical steps, budget considerations, and measurable outcomes. Her tone was respectful but confident. As she spoke, Daniel watched the executive's expressions shift from polite tolerance to genuine interest. By the end of her explanation, even the most skeptical executive nodded. Vanessa, sitting across from her, whispered to another board member, I told you, she's not what you expected. Calm, precise, and insightful. Daniel's hand brushed lightly against Emily's under the table, a subtle acknowledgement of her quiet triumph. After the meeting, Margaret Whitmore invited Emily for a brief walk in the gardens. The morning air was crisp, and dew glistened on the manicured lawns. Emily, Margaret began, I must admit, I wasn't sure about you at first. Your modesty, your simplicity. It made me question how you'd handle this environment. Emily looked at her calmly. I understand. First impressions often reveal more about the observer than the observed. Margaret considered this. You handled the breakfast beautifully. You were measured, confident, and yet understated. It's not something we see often in people your age. Emily smiled softly. Thank you, Margaret. I believe that subtle influence often speaks louder than words or appearances. It's about showing consistency, earning respect, and observing before reacting. Margaret studied her for a moment, then nodded thoughtfully. I see that now. Your approach, it's effective, quietly effective. Returning inside, Emily joined Daniel for lunch in a small cafeteria on the estate grounds. They spoke about her impressions of the breakfast meeting, her observations about the executives, and the subtle dynamics she had noticed. "I noticed how everyone's assumptions influenced their decisions," she said. "If they had dismissed me entirely, they'd have missed valuable insights." Daniel smiled. "That's exactly why I trust you so much. You notice what most people overlook." Emily looked out the window at the city skyline. "I've learned that small, deliberate choices, the ones most people ignore, can shape outcomes more than the grand gestures everyone focuses on." Daniel nodded, understanding the lesson not just professionally but personally. In their relationship, as in life, respect, trust and influence were built one careful choice at a time. That evening, Emily returned home and reflected on the week's experiences. She thought about the boutique dress, the formal dinner, the luncheons, and now the breakfast meeting. Each situation had been a test of her character, patience, and ability to remain grounded under scrutiny. She realized that her approach, quiet, consistent, and observant, had created a ripple effect. Daniel's family, initially skeptical, was beginning to recognize her value beyond surface impressions. Even the executives who doubted her subtly adjusted their perspective. Emily also understood a deeper lesson. Influence didn't require arrogance or dominance. It required clarity, integrity, and the courage to act in alignment with one's values. In every interaction, she had consciously chosen observation over judgment, calm over defensiveness, and honesty over performance. Daniel called her later that night. "How are you feeling after today?" he asked. Emily smiled, reclining on her couch. "I feel understood. Not by everyone, not yet, but enough that their respect will follow if they continue to pay attention." Daniel's voice was soft but firm. "I knew from the start you could handle this. Not because you're perfect, but because you're consistent. You act with intention, and people notice, even if they don't say it aloud." Emily paused, reflecting on the truth of his words. It's remarkable how small choices, returning a dress, observing quietly, speaking honestly, can shape so much. It's almost invisible, yet profoundly effective. Daniel laughed softly. "Exactly. And that's why I keep learning from you every day." Emily leaned back, eyes thoughtful. "I think that's the point of life too. Love, work, relationships, they're all built through consistent, deliberate choices. The small things often matter more than the grand gestures everyone expects." Daniel's hand reached for hers across the table. "Then I guess we're building something quietly powerful together." Emily squeezed his hand gently. Yes, quietly, consistently, deliberately. And in that moment, both of them understood something vital. Success, respect, and love weren't born from appearances, dramatic gestures, or wealth. They were born from the consistent, deliberate choices made every day, the ones that were easy to overlook but impossible to ignore once their effects became clear. "Before we move on, Pookie, I want to hear from you. Have you ever experienced a situation where small, quiet choices made a bigger impact than any big gesture could? Maybe at work, with family, or in your relationships? Share your story in the comments. I love reading how small actions have shaped real lives. Your experiences might help someone else see the value of consistency and integrity. And if you're enjoying Emily and Daniel's journey, make sure to like this video, share it with someone who values life lessons, and subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson so you never miss a story that shows how quiet strength and deliberate choices shape love, respect, and trust. Let's keep following Emily's story. The next chapter is where expectations, boundaries, and personal growth collide. The morning sun spilled across the Whitmore estate as Daniel and Emily prepared for another visit with his family. This time, it wasn't a social dinner, nor a casual business meeting. It was a planning session, a discussion about upcoming charitable events and the family's philanthropic initiatives. Emily adjusted the simple blouse she had chosen for the day, thinking about how appearances often carried weight in the Whitmore world. Not wealth or status, necessarily, but the way someone presented themselves conveyed expectations, intentions, and sometimes even their perceived competence. "Are you ready?" Daniel asked, a quiet smile on his face. "I am," Emily replied, taking a deep breath. Ready to observe and act deliberately, Daniel reached for her hand as they walked through the estate's long corridors. "I have no doubt you'll handle it well, but remember, it's not just about impressing my parents, it's about navigating expectations, both theirs and your own." Emily nodded thoughtfully. She had been thinking about that a lot lately. Expectations weren't inherently negative. They shaped behavior, clarified priorities, and sometimes pushed people to grow. But they could also weigh heavily, especially when they conflicted with personal values. The meeting took place in a bright, wood-paneled conference room. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting a warm glow on the polished oak table. Daniel's parents sat at the head of the table, Margaret with her usual composed demeanor, Charles quietly observing, and a few trusted executives alongside them. "Emily," Charles began, "we're glad you could join us today. We wanted to discuss the upcoming community gala and the projects your input could influence. Emily smiled politely. Thank you for including me. I'm looking forward to contributing wherever I can. Margaret studied her quietly. You've adapted well to our environment, she said. But now, we'd like to see how you handle complex decisions under pressure. Daniel glanced at Emily. It's just another discussion, he whispered. Observe first. Act when necessary. Emily nodded. She had learned that timing mattered as much as content. Speaking too soon or overcomplicating her input could create misunderstandings. The first topic was the gala's charitable auction. Several high-value items were under consideration, and different board members had conflicting opinions about their presentation and messaging. One executive suggested focusing purely on luxury appeal to attract higher donations. Another argued for emphasizing the community impact of the projects. Emily listened quietly, noting the underlying tension. May I? She asked. Once the conversation paused, all eyes turned to her. Both perspectives are valid, she began, but the impact can be maximized if we integrate them. Highlight the luxury items to attract donors, but connect each purchase to a tangible community benefit. That way, attendees feel both the exclusivity and the responsibility of giving. The room fell silent briefly. Margaret raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Emily continued. Additionally, we could include small stories from families who benefited from past projects. Short, compelling narratives paired with the items being auctioned. It personalizes the experience and ensures the focus remains on why we're hosting the event. Charles leaned back, nodding slowly. Interesting. You've managed to address both priorities without dismissing either. Daniel's subtle smile was unmistakable. Emily had once again balanced observation, clarity, and strategy, without pushing, without drama, simply presenting the solution that aligned with values. Later, the discussion turned to volunteer coordination for the gala. Several executives had varying opinions on how to structure teams, delegate tasks, and measure outcomes. Emily took a seat quietly, reviewing her notes. She noticed a recurring issue. Many people were thinking about efficiency, but not sustainability. If I may, she said softly, we could implement a system where volunteers rotate between tasks, allowing them to gain experience in multiple areas while preventing burnout. It may initially take slightly longer to train them, but it ensures a more skilled, resilient volunteer base over time. Another pause. Then Charles spoke. You anticipate consequences that most people overlook. That's valuable. Emily smiled politely, careful not to let pride show. I've found that long-term thinking often produces better outcomes than immediate solutions, especially when people's well-being is involved. Margaret, usually reserved, nodded appreciatively. Your perspective aligns with the principles we value. It's rare to see someone with both operational insight and empathy. Daniel glanced at Emily across the table. Their eyes met briefly, a quiet acknowledgement that she was navigating expectations flawlessly, not through dominance, but through careful observation and principled action. After the meeting, Emily and Daniel walked through the gardens. The air was fresh with early spring scents, and birds chirped softly in the distance. That went well, Daniel said, smiling. You handled their expectations without trying to please them. You were firm, thoughtful, and consistent. Emily nodded. I realized that expectations are like a map. They guide behavior, but they don't dictate values. You can meet expectations without compromising integrity if you approach them deliberately. Daniel took a deep breath. And that's why I love you. Most people either rebel against expectations or bend too easily. You navigate them without losing yourself. Emily smiled softly. It's not always easy, but it's worth it. Love, work, and family. None of it works without understanding and respecting boundaries while making deliberate choices. Daniel paused, looking at her seriously. Do you ever worry that my parents will never fully accept you? Emily considered the question carefully. Acceptance isn't about immediate approval. It's about consistent behavior that demonstrates your character over time. If they observe carefully, they'll see who I am, and that's enough. Daniel nodded, feeling reassured. I think you're right. And I know that whatever comes next, we'll handle it together. That evening, Emily reflected on her experiences. She thought about the delicate balance of meeting expectations while remaining true to herself. She realized that many people misunderstood power. It wasn't about control, appearances, or wealth. True influence came from consistency, observation, and principled action. She also recognized another truth. Navigating expectations required empathy. Understanding where others were coming from didn't mean agreeing with them blindly. It meant seeing their perspective, anticipating reactions, and acting in a way that preserved one's own integrity. Emily understood that this lesson applied not only to the Whitmore family, but to every relationship in her life. Personal and professional success, as well as love, depended on deliberate choices that aligned with one's values, even when others imposed pressure. Daniel called later that night. How are you feeling after today? Emily smiled, settling onto her couch. Empowered. Not because I impressed anyone, but because I stayed true to myself while meeting expectations. That feels rare but important. Daniel's voice softened. That's why I trust you completely. You understand balance. You understand subtlety. And you understand that integrity outweighs appearances every time. Emily leaned back, thinking about everything that had unfolded. The boutique dress, the dinners, the luncheons, the meetings, and the breakfast discussion. Each situation, each small decision, had quietly shaped outcomes and earned respect. I think, she said quietly, that life is built on small, deliberate choices, some invisible, some visible, and over time, they define who we are, what we achieve, and the love we earn. Daniel smiled. Then we're building something quietly powerful. Together. Emily nodded. Yes. Quietly, deliberately, consistently. As the city lights flickered through her window, both knew this lesson, navigating expectations without compromising values, would serve them for years to come. Not as a grand gesture, but as a steady, quiet strength that would shape both their love and their lives. The following day brought another challenge. Daniel's parents had arranged an informal dinner with close family friends, people who had long-standing ties to the Whitmore legacy. Emily knew this would be another subtle test. It wasn't about formalities or luxury. It was about perception, patience, and the ability to navigate nuanced social expectations. When Emily arrived, the house buzzed with activity. Guests mingled in the sitting room, exchanging pleasantries and light jokes. The conversation carried an undertone of evaluation, as if each guest was scanning for worth and influence. Emily reminded herself of a principle she had been practicing for months. Observation first, action second. Daniel met her at the door. Relax, he whispered. Tonight is as much about showing character as it is about small talk. Emily smiled. I've learned that subtle actions often speak louder than words. As the dinner began, Emily engaged in polite conversation, listening more than speaking. A few guests asked about her background, her career, and her experience in housing development. She responded with concise honesty, never over-explaining, never seeking approval. One guest, an elderly man who had built a fortune in real estate, leaned forward. So, you manage projects for low-income communities? He asked, skepticism clear in his voice. Emily nodded. Yes. I believe stable housing is foundational for strong communities. Every project I lead focuses on long-term impact, not just immediate returns. He paused, then raised an eyebrow. Interesting perspective. Most people I meet in your position talk about profits first. Emily kept her tone calm. Impact and sustainability often lead to better outcomes, including financial ones, over time. The two aren't mutually exclusive. The man's expression softened. You've clearly thought about this carefully. Daniel watched quietly, proud. Emily had once again navigated a potential trap with poise, subtly demonstrating intelligence and integrity, without confrontation. During the meal, Margaret leaned slightly toward Emily. I must admit, you surprise me, she said softly. I expected charm and courtesy, but you bring something deeper. Emily smiled politely. I believe respect and understanding are more enduring than charm. Margaret nodded. It's rare to encounter someone who can balance humility with quiet confidence. You've handled every situation deliberately. Emily kept her expression neutral, knowing that overreacting or appearing proud could undo her carefully built presence. The subtle acknowledgement was enough. She understood that influence often worked in silence. Later, the conversation turned to social expectations. Several guests discussed the pressures of family legacy, wealth, and public perception. Emily listened intently, noting the assumptions that shaped behavior. One woman commented, "It must be exhausting to constantly maintain appearances." Emily responded thoughtfully, "I think the challenge lies not in appearances but in alignment. If your actions reflect your values, appearances become secondary. But if they don't, no amount of effort will satisfy expectations." A brief silence followed. Then the same elderly man from earlier said, "You speak with unusual clarity. Most people try to fit in, instead of staying true to themselves." Emily's lips curved into a soft smile. Staying true to oneself requires deliberate choices, especially in environments where expectations are high. It's not easy, but it's necessary. Daniel squeezed her hand under the table, a quiet acknowledgement of her continued success. As the evening concluded, Daniel and Emily walked through the estate gardens under a canopy of stars. The night air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of blooming flowers. "You handled tonight flawlessly," Daniel said quietly. "No defensiveness, no pretense. You simply observed, responded, and stayed true to yourself." Emily exhaled softly. It wasn't about being flawless. It was about deliberate choices. Every word, every gesture, every pause. Small actions can shape perceptions more than the grand ones we often think matter. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. It's remarkable. Most people try too hard to impress. You don't. And that's why people notice you in a meaningful way. Emily smiled, her eyes reflecting the starlight. Influence is rarely about visibility. It's about substance and consistency. What people see immediately is rarely what truly matters. The quiet, deliberate choices, those are the ones that endure. The following week, Emily faced another subtle test, an unexpected business meeting with several of Daniel's extended family members who had stakes in a charitable foundation. They wanted her input on a proposal involving community housing initiatives. Emily had to balance professional insight with awareness of family dynamics. She approached the meeting as she always had, listening first, observing power dynamics, and then speaking when she had clarity. Her suggestions were practical and strategic. She recommended phased implementation, volunteer rotations, and measurable long-term impact. By the end of the meeting, the family members were impressed. Several whispered among themselves about how rare it was to find someone who combined expertise with understated confidence. Daniel watched quietly, feeling a quiet pride. Emily's influence was growing, not through force or charm, but through deliberate, consistent actions that aligned with her values. That night, Emily and Daniel sat together on the balcony of her apartment, overlooking the city lights. Do you ever feel like all of this, the dinners, the meetings, the expectations, will ever end? Emily asked softly. Daniel shook his head. No, but that's the point. Life is full of expectations, pressures, and judgments. What matters is how we navigate them, without losing ourselves. Emily nodded. I've realized that small, consistent choices are more powerful than grand gestures. They shape trust, respect, and influence in ways people don't always notice immediately. But over time, the impact is undeniable. Daniel reached for her hand. And that's why I trust you completely. You understand balance, integrity, and influence better than anyone I've ever met. Emily smiled, leaning her head lightly on his shoulder. It's a lesson that goes beyond business or family. It applies to love too. Consistency, honesty, and deliberate choices build a foundation stronger than charm or wealth ever could. Daniel kissed the top of her head gently. And that's exactly why I fell in love with you. Emily closed her eyes for a moment, savoring the quiet certainty of the words. They didn't need fireworks or grand declarations. Their love was rooted in respect, trust, and deliberate actions, quiet but unshakable. As the city lights shimmered below, both understood that navigating expectations, whether in family, business, or love, required patience, insight, and integrity. And with every small choice, Emily and Daniel were building a life where love coexisted with honesty, boundaries, and earned dignity. The week began quietly, yet Emily sensed an undercurrent of expectation. Daniel had scheduled a meeting with his personal assistant, his business manager, and one of his longtime family advisors. This wasn't just about work. It was about trust, boundaries, and how Emily would navigate environments where personal and professional lines often blurred. Emily adjusted her blazer in the mirror. She had spent months refining her approach to situations like this, listening first, observing patterns, and speaking deliberately. It was a delicate balance, overstep, and she risked offending, stay too quiet, and she might be perceived as uninvolved. Daniel appeared at the door. Ready? He asked, his usual quiet confidence evident. Emily nodded. I'm ready. Let's just focus on clarity, respect, and consistency. Daniel's hand brushed hers briefly, a silent acknowledgement. Exactly. The meeting began in a sleek conference room filled with natural light. Daniel introduced Emily, noting her expertise in community development and organizational planning. The advisors and managers exchanged polite nods, and then the discussion turned to an upcoming project, a philanthropic initiative supporting underprivileged neighborhoods while engaging the company's staff. Several family advisors had differing opinions on the allocation of funds, volunteer responsibilities, and oversight. Emily listened carefully, noting the tension. Some focused on efficiency, others on appearances, and a few on personal recognition. When the conversation reached a point where disagreements threatened to stall progress, Emily spoke. If we focus on transparency and measurable outcomes, we can balance all priorities. Volunteers will know their roles and the impact of their work. Staff recognition can be integrated thoughtfully, and community benefit remains central. Each choice doesn't have to be exclusive. They can complement one another. A pause. Then one of the managers said, "You've thought this through. It's refreshing to hear such a balanced perspective." Emily nodded. I believe consistency and clarity in decision-making prevent misunderstandings and maintain trust. Daniel watched quietly. Emily was not just contributing, she was modeling a way to navigate boundaries, professional, personal, and ethical, without conflict or compromise. After the meeting, Daniel suggested a walk in the estate gardens. The early afternoon sun warmed their faces, and the air carried the faint scent of jasmine. You handled that beautifully, Daniel said. You didn't just participate, you set a tone for the whole room. Emily smiled softly. It's not about control or dominance. Boundaries aren't walls. They're guides for respectful interaction. I focused on clarity, not approval, and integrity, not performance. Daniel nodded. It's remarkable how you consistently transform potential tension into understanding. Most people would feel intimidated in that room. Emily leaned back slightly. Intimidation disappears when you focus on principles instead of perceptions. Boundaries, clear priorities, and consistent behavior create trust. Both ways. Daniel's hand found hers again. And that's why I trust you completely. You don't bend under pressure, you navigate it intelligently. That evening, Emily returned to her apartment and reflected on the week's events. She thought about the subtle tests, the dinners, meetings, and now boundary-setting scenarios. Each situation demanded deliberate choices: when to speak, when to remain silent, how to assert influence without overstepping. She realized that most people misunderstood boundaries. They treated them as restrictions rather than as tools for mutual respect and clarity. Emily understood that boundaries were not about keeping others out. They were about defining space where honesty, integrity, and trust could flourish. Her phone buzzed. A message from Daniel: dinner tomorrow. Just us. No tests. Emily smiled. Even amidst all the subtle complexities of his family and business, he remembered the importance of balance, of personal connection alongside obligations and expectations. The next day, they had a rare evening to themselves. Daniel suggested cooking together in her apartment. It was simple, domestic, and completely removed from boardrooms and mansions. As they chopped vegetables and stirred sauces, Emily reflected aloud. I've realized that boundaries aren't just professional. They exist in relationships too. Knowing when to listen, when to speak, when to give space. Those are the subtle choices that preserve respect and intimacy. Daniel stirred the sauce thoughtfully. I think that's the lesson we've been learning all along. Small choices shape the bigger picture. It's not about grand gestures. It's about consistent, thoughtful action. Emily nodded. Exactly. And boundaries allow us to act intentionally rather than react impulsively. They protect integrity and build trust. Daniel reached for her hand across the counter. And that trust, it's what makes our relationship strong. Not wealth, not appearances, but honesty, respect, and deliberate choices. Emily squeezed his hand gently. Yes. Love isn't just passion. It's discipline, patience, and consistent effort. Later that week, Emily faced a more personal challenge. One of Daniel's close cousins, visiting from another city, invited her to join a small social gathering. The cousin's subtle tone suggested an expectation. Emily should fit into a world of luxury, socialites, and understated competition. Emily accepted, determined to maintain her principles while navigating the social nuance. At the gathering, she observed carefully, engaging politely but without attempting to impress. She listened to conversations about wealth, influence, and family history, but instead focused on learning about values, priorities, and subtle social cues. When a pointed remark about her modest clothing arose, Emily responded gracefully, I prefer simplicity. It allows me to focus on people, projects, and principles, rather than appearances. A brief silence followed, then an approving nod from a family friend. Emily's approach wasn't about confrontation or rebellion. It was about setting a boundary while remaining respectful. Daniel watched with admiration. Once again, Emily's deliberate, consistent actions earned respect in an environment where many would have faltered. By the end of the evening, Emily had earned not just polite acknowledgement, but genuine curiosity and interest. Guests began asking her questions about her career, her projects, and her perspectives. They realized that her quiet confidence and principled approach were more compelling than charm, wealth, or status. Daniel and Emily left the gathering quietly, walking through the landscaped gardens under the soft glow of outdoor lights. You handled that perfectly, Daniel said. You maintained your integrity and set boundaries without offense. That's rare in any social setting. Emily smiled. It's a practice, observing, listening, and acting deliberately. Boundaries aren't walls, they're guides. They protect both people and relationships. Daniel nodded. And that's exactly why I know our relationship will endure. We respect each other's boundaries and act intentionally, even when it's difficult. Emily looked up at the sky, feeling the weight of the lessons she had learned. Consistency, boundaries, integrity. These are the invisible choices that shape outcomes, relationships, and trust. They matter more than any dramatic gesture or instant impression. Daniel took a deep breath. And that's why I love you. Not for appearances, not for what you do, but for who you are, and how you consistently choose to act with integrity. Emily rested her head on his shoulder. And I love you for the same reason. Because even with all the expectations, pressures, and subtle tests, we navigate together, intentionally, thoughtfully, consistently. The night was quiet, but the lesson was clear. Boundaries, when applied with clarity and respect, were not obstacles. They were tools for building enduring love, trust, and dignity. And Emily knew that every small, deliberate choice they made together would continue shaping not just their relationship, but their lives. The following morning, Emily received a message from Margaret Whitmore, a private lunch meeting at the estate. The tone was polite but carried an unmistakable undertone of curiosity and subtle evaluation. Emily understood that this was not just a social invitation. It was a test of her composure, insight, and ability to navigate delicate family dynamics. Daniel walked beside her as they drove. "Remember," he said, "this is about listening, observing, and responding thoughtfully. Don't feel pressured to perform or impress." Emily smiled softly. "I know. Boundaries first, reactions second." He squeezed her hand. "Exactly. You've handled every situation so far with grace. This one won't be any different." The estate's dining room was bathed in warm sunlight, streaming through large windows overlooking the gardens. Margaret greeted Emily with a composed smile, gesturing to the carefully arranged table. "I thought we could talk privately, away from the others," she said. Emily nodded. "Thank you for the invitation. I'm happy to join you." Margaret studied her silently for a moment. "Emily, I've watched how you navigate our family dynamics, our meetings, and even social gatherings. You handle expectations, subtle pressures, and sometimes outright challenges with remarkable consistency." Emily responded politely. "I appreciate your observation. I've learned that deliberate choices, clear boundaries, and integrity often create more impact than trying to fit in or impress others." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "True. But there are times when maintaining those boundaries may create friction. How do you manage that?" Emily paused, considering. "I believe friction is inevitable when values conflict or expectations differ. The key is to act with respect, communicate clearly, and avoid unnecessary compromise. Boundaries protect integrity. They're not obstacles to cooperation." Margaret studied her closely. "And in relationships?" she asked, her tone slightly softer. Emily smiled faintly. "The same principle applies. Respect, honesty, and consistent action build trust. Boundaries ensure that love and respect remain mutual rather than one-sided." Margaret's expression softened. It's rare to hear such a balanced perspective, especially from someone outside the family. Emily kept her composure, aware that humility was as important as confidence. "I found that subtle influence and consistent behavior are often more effective than charm or status. People notice patterns, not performance." Lunch passed with light conversation, but Margaret subtly tested Emily's responses. She brought up topics about philanthropy, family legacy, and long-term planning, framing questions in ways that could reveal ego, defensiveness, or compromise. Emily answered thoughtfully, focusing on clarity, fairness, and actionable solutions. She never overstepped, nor did she shy away from addressing difficult points. The conversation flowed naturally, demonstrating her ability to navigate complex expectations while maintaining integrity. By the end of the meal, Margaret's demeanor had shifted from reserved evaluation to quiet respect. "You've demonstrated not only knowledge and insight, but also the ability to maintain personal integrity in challenging situations. That's impressive." Emily nodded politely, understanding that influence often worked quietly, without applause. Later that day, Daniel and Emily met for a casual walk in the city park. The afternoon sun reflected off the river, creating a tranquil atmosphere that contrasted sharply with the morning's strategic conversation. "You handled that lunch remarkably," Daniel said. "I could see Margaret's respect growing with every answer you gave. You didn't try to earn it. It came naturally from your approach." Emily smiled. "Boundaries, consistency, and clarity guide every interaction. People notice patterns more than performances. Respect follows naturally when you act deliberately and ethically." Daniel paused, thinking. "It's fascinating to see how you navigate subtle social pressures without losing yourself. Most people get lost trying to fit in." Emily looked at him, eyes bright. "Fitting in often requires compromise of values. I'd rather stand firm quietly and influence outcomes than bend to appearances." Daniel nodded. "And that's why I know our relationship is strong. You bring integrity, not drama. Consistency, not charm. That's rare in any setting, personal or professional." The following week, Emily faced a particularly delicate situation. A miscommunication had occurred between Daniel and one of the project managers. A task had been delegated incorrectly, causing tension among staff. Emily was asked to mediate. She approached the situation deliberately. First, she listened to both sides, identifying where assumptions and misaligned expectations had created conflict. Then, she suggested practical adjustments, clarifying responsibilities and timelines without assigning blame. Her approach was calm, focused, and consistent. Within hours, tension eased, and the team regained efficiency. Daniel watched quietly, proud of her ability to maintain respect, enforce boundaries, and resolve conflict effectively. Emily reflected afterward. Navigating challenges wasn't about asserting dominance or winning arguments, it was about understanding perspectives, setting clear boundaries, and fostering mutual respect. That evening, Emily and Daniel had dinner at her apartment. They discussed the week's challenges and successes. "I realized something today," Emily said, stirring her tea thoughtfully. "Boundaries aren't just personal, they're relational. They define how people interact, how trust is maintained, and how influence is respected." Daniel nodded. "Exactly. And the way you handle them inspires confidence, not just in me, but in everyone who interacts with you." Emily smiled softly. "It's a practice. Every interaction, no matter how small, is an opportunity to reinforce values, establish trust, and maintain clarity." Daniel reached across the table, holding her hand. "And that's exactly why I admire you. You understand that love, respect, and trust are built slowly, deliberately, and consistently, not through gestures or appearances, but through everyday choices." Emily leaned back, feeling the quiet weight of their shared lesson. "Every interaction matters, Daniel. Every choice, even the small or invisible ones, shapes relationships, outcomes, and personal growth." Daniel kissed her forehead gently. "And that's why I'm certain our relationship will endure. Because we act intentionally, respect boundaries, and consistently choose integrity over convenience." Emily smiled, her eyes reflecting the soft glow of the dining room lights. "Yes. Quietly, deliberately, consistently. That's how we navigate life and love together." As the evening drew to a close, both understood a fundamental truth. Boundaries, when applied thoughtfully and consistently, were not limitations but tools. Tools that preserved dignity, reinforced respect, and allowed love and trust to flourish in even the most complex environments. And Emily knew that every choice, small, deliberate, principled, would continue shaping not just her relationship with Daniel, but the broader network of family, colleagues, and community she was steadily influencing. The morning sunlight streamed gently through the tall windows of Emily's apartment. She sipped her coffee, thinking about the months that had passed, the quiet tests, the subtle choices, the moments of observation, reflection, and deliberate action. Each small decision had shaped her relationship with Daniel, with his family, and with herself in ways she could never have imagined. Daniel entered the room quietly, carrying a folder of papers. "Morning," he said softly, placing it on the kitchen counter. "We've got a full day ahead. I wanted to review the plans before the meeting with the foundation board." Emily smiled. "Morning. Let's take it step by step. We've learned that rushing rarely produces clarity." He chuckled. "Exactly. It's remarkable how much patience and observation matter, even in decision-making. I've seen you apply it everywhere, from family dinners to boardroom discussions." Emily set her cup down. "It's about consistency and deliberate choices. Every small action matters. Every word, gesture, and decision has ripple effects." Daniel nodded thoughtfully. "And that's what makes us stronger together. Quietly, consistently, deliberately." The meeting with the foundation board was scheduled at the Whitmore estate. Emily felt a mixture of anticipation and calm. Unlike previous gatherings, this one carried higher stakes. Decisions about community programs, volunteer engagement, and financial allocations that would impact dozens of neighborhoods. As they entered the boardroom, Emily noted the dynamics immediately. Senior advisors seated strategically, Daniel's parents observing from the corner, and several family friends who had long-standing involvement in the foundation. Charles Whitmore greeted them. "Emily, Daniel, thank you for joining us today. We're eager to hear your perspectives on the upcoming projects." Emily nodded politely. "Thank you for including me. I hope to provide insight that balances practicality with long-term community impact." The discussion began with proposals for several initiatives, some ambitious, others more modest. Tension emerged quickly when differing priorities clashed. Volunteer resources, funding allocation, and program sustainability were all points of debate. Emily listened first, observing the subtle power dynamics, noticing assumptions and repeated patterns of miscommunication. Only then did she speak. "If I may," she said softly, "I believe we can structure these initiatives in a phased approach. Each project can include measurable outcomes, rotating, volunteer responsibilities, and transparent reporting. That way, impact is maximized, and everyone involved understands their contribution clearly." A brief pause followed. Then Charles Whitmore spoke. "You've articulated a framework that addresses multiple concerns without dismissing anyone's priorities. That's impressive." Emily continued with practical steps for implementation, integrating feedback from several advisors. She emphasized clarity, consistency, and respect for all stakeholders, demonstrating how small, deliberate choices could align complex priorities and reinforce trust. Daniel watched quietly, impressed once again by Emily's ability to influence without force, to lead without dominating, and to earn respect quietly but consistently. After the meeting, Emily and Daniel walked through the estate gardens. The afternoon sun illuminated the carefully manicured lawns and flower beds, a serene backdrop for reflection. You handled that exceptionally well, Daniel said. You didn't just navigate expectations. You transformed them into collaboration. It's remarkable. Emily smiled softly. I've realized that quiet love, like quiet influence, grows through consistency and trust. It's not about dramatic gestures or declarations. It's about showing up, choosing integrity, and making deliberate choices every day. Daniel nodded. That's exactly why our relationship works. We've built trust, understanding, and mutual respect slowly, deliberately, and consistently. That's stronger than any grand gesture could ever be. Emily's eyes followed a path through the garden. Every challenge we faced, the dinners, meetings, social gatherings, taught us the same lesson: subtle, principled choices create enduring strength. Daniel stopped, taking her hands gently. And that strength, it's what will carry us through everything, together. The following evening, Emily and Daniel hosted a small gathering for close family and friends. This was not a formal meeting, nor a strategic discussion. It was a celebration of shared efforts, achievements, and quiet perseverance. Emily moved through the room with ease, engaging in conversation, offering insights, and listening carefully. She noticed how small acts, acknowledging contributions, expressing genuine interest, and maintaining composure, elicited more respect than any attempt to impress. At one point, Margaret Whitmore approached her quietly. Emily, I must admit, I've been observing your journey for months. You've shown that integrity, consistency, and thoughtful choices earn respect in ways appearances never could. It's rare to see someone navigate our family's world with such quiet strength. Emily smiled politely. Thank you, Margaret. I've learned that trust and influence aren't won through appearances or status. They're earned through deliberate, principled actions. Small choices, consistently applied, create lasting impact. Margaret nodded slowly, a subtle acknowledgement of Emily's growth and the bond she developed with Daniel's family. Later, Daniel and Emily stepped onto the balcony, overlooking the city lights. The evening air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of night-blooming flowers. I've been thinking, Emily said, about how far we've come, each challenge, each small decision. It wasn't always visible, but it mattered. And now, the strength of our relationship feels undeniable. Daniel smiled, brushing her hair gently. It's because we've approached it deliberately. We respect boundaries, communicate honestly, and act with integrity. Love is quiet when it's built on trust and consistency. It doesn't need to shout. Emily leaned against him. It's remarkable how small, intentional actions, listening, observing, responding thoughtfully, can accumulate into something so profound. That's what I think love really is, the culmination of all the little deliberate choices we make every day. Daniel held her close. And that's why I know we can face anything together. Every challenge, expectation, or misstep is an opportunity to act deliberately, with integrity, and with each other in mind. Emily smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. Quiet love is stronger than I ever imagined. It doesn't need drama or grandeur. It grows through patience, consistency, and trust. Daniel nodded. And that's exactly what we've built. Together, the city skyline shimmered beneath them as they stood in quiet reflection. Emily knew that every subtle choice, every deliberate act of integrity, had shaped the relationship into something resilient, respectful, and deeply rooted. She realized that the lessons they had learned weren't limited to family, work, or social expectations. They applied to life itself. Consistency, boundaries, observation, and principled action were the tools that created trust, influence, and lasting love. Emily took Daniel's hand, squeezing it gently. We've built something quietly powerful, not flashy, not instantaneous, but enduring. And that's worth more than anything else. Daniel smiled, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead. Exactly. Quiet love, deliberate choices, consistent integrity. That's our strength. And in that shared moment, both understood the ultimate lesson. Life, relationships, and love were shaped not by grand gestures, wealth, or appearances, but by the quiet, deliberate choices made day after day, consistently and with intention. Emily leaned back, feeling a deep sense of peace. Every challenge they had faced, every expectation they had navigated, every subtle choice they had made had led them here, to a love defined by trust, respect, and integrity. And for the first time in a long time, she felt the profound certainty that the strength of their quiet love would endure all tests, all expectations, and all time. The next morning, Emily awoke with a sense of calm that had been rare in the months leading up to this point. The tests, the subtle evaluations, and the delicate negotiations, all of it, had revealed a pattern. Deliberate choices, consistency, and integrity created more enduring influence than any dramatic gesture or attempt to impress. Daniel was already in the kitchen preparing coffee. He smiled when he saw her. Morning. Sleep well? Emily nodded, pouring herself a cup. Yes, I've been reflecting on everything we've learned about boundaries, respect, and how small actions shape trust and love. He set the coffee on the table. It's remarkable, isn't it? How much impact comes from simple, intentional acts. Emily smiled. Yes, quiet love, like quiet influence, grows slowly, deliberately, and consistently. It's not flashy, but it endures. Later that day, they visited a community project Daniel and Emily had worked on together, a housing initiative for underprivileged families. Emily walked through the site, observing volunteers coordinating seamlessly, families interacting with staff, and children playing safely. She turned to Daniel. All these months of planning, all the small decisions, have created something real. Not just structures, but trust, hope, and stability. Daniel nodded. It's proof of the power of deliberate action. And the same applies to us. Our love, our relationship. Every choice we've made, small or large, has built this foundation. Emily reflected quietly. She realized that relationships, like projects, required attention, consistency, and clear boundaries. Love wasn't an event. It was a process, an accumulation of intentional choices that respected both individuals' values and needs. That evening, Emily and Daniel returned to the estate for a family dinner. It wasn't a test this time. It was an acknowledgement. Margaret and Charles Whitmore greeted them warmly, their usual reserve softened by months of observation and trust. "You've both done remarkable work," Charles said. "Emily, your integrity and consistency have not gone unnoticed. You've shown that quiet, deliberate choices create trust more effectively than any display of wealth or charm." Margaret added, "It's clear that your partnership is built on mutual respect, understanding, and thoughtful action. That's the strongest foundation for love, and for any relationship, personal or professional." Emily smiled gently. "Thank you. I've learned that love, like trust, grows quietly through deliberate actions, clear boundaries, and consistent integrity." Daniel squeezed her hand under the table, a quiet acknowledgement that they had both learned and applied the same principles. After dinner, Emily and Daniel took a walk through the estate gardens. The night was calm, and the stars reflected in the still waters of a nearby fountain. "I can't believe how far we've come," Emily said softly. "Every challenge, every subtle choice, every deliberate action. It all feels like it's led to this moment." Daniel nodded. "It has. And what's remarkable is that our love didn't require drama or grand gestures. It's quiet, intentional, and incredibly strong because of it." Emily looked at him thoughtfully. "I think that's the lesson we've learned. Love grows through small, consistent choices, choosing honesty, choosing respect, choosing integrity. And boundaries are not limitations. They're guides for preserving trust and dignity." Daniel held her close. "Exactly. And that's why I know we can face anything together. We've built something enduring, not fleeting. Something real, not performative." Emily rested her head on his shoulder. "Quiet love, deliberate action, and consistency. That's what makes it strong. That's what makes it last." In the weeks that followed, Emily and Daniel continued to navigate family, business, and community initiatives. Yet their focus remained the same: deliberate, principled action. They communicated honestly, respected each other's boundaries, and approached challenges as partners, not competitors. Emily reflected on a lesson that had become central to her life. Small, consistent choices, whether in love, work, or personal growth, accumulate over time. They define character, shape outcomes, and build trust in ways that are often invisible but deeply enduring. Daniel noticed the change in her demeanor as well. "You've grown stronger through all of this," he said one evening, "not because anyone tested you, but because you've chosen consistently, deliberately, and ethically every step of the way." Emily smiled. "It wasn't always easy, but every choice mattered, even the small ones. Quiet decisions, made with integrity, create strength. That's what we've built together." One Sunday afternoon, they hosted a small gathering at Emily's apartment, a mix of family, friends, and colleagues. It was a celebration, not a performance. People shared stories, laughed, and acknowledged achievements. Emily observed quietly, noticing patterns of collaboration, mutual respect, and trust. She realized that the principles they had practiced, observation, deliberate choice, boundary setting, and consistency, were now reflected in the environment around them. People were engaging authentically because Emily and Daniel had modeled those behaviors. Later, Daniel leaned toward her. "Do you see it?" he whispered. "Quiet love, consistent choices, and integrity ripple outward. They influence more than just our relationship. They shape the world around us." Emily nodded. "I do. And that's the true strength of quiet love. It doesn't demand attention. It doesn't rely on appearances. It endures because it's deliberate, principled, and consistent." That night, Emily and Daniel sat together on the balcony, overlooking the city skyline. The lights shimmered like countless reminders of the lives their actions had touched, the trust they had earned, and the love they had nurtured. "I've realized something," Emily said softly. Love is not about intensity or drama. It's about consistency, respect, and deliberate action. That's what makes it strong, enduring, and meaningful. Daniel nodded, holding her hand. And we built it together, through patience, observation, and principled choices. Every challenge, every expectation, every subtle decision led us here. Emily leaned against him, breathing in the calm night air. Quiet love, deliberate action, consistent integrity. That's how we've created something real, unshakable, and lasting. Daniel kissed her forehead gently. And that, Emily, is why I know this love will endure. Through time, challenges, and life itself. Not because it's dramatic, but because it's intentional and principled. Emily closed her eyes, feeling the profound certainty of the moment. Every subtle decision, every deliberate action, every choice guided by integrity and respect had led to this love. Quiet, strong, and enduring. And in that quiet certainty, both Emily and Daniel knew the strength of quiet love was unshakable. Not perfect, not glamorous, but real, principled, and lasting. They had built it together, deliberately, consistently, and with integrity, an enduring testament to the power of quiet choices shaping lives, relationships, and love. Emily and Daniel's journey shows that love isn't about grand gestures or dramatic moments. It's built quietly, deliberately, and consistently. Now it's your turn. How do you nurture trust, respect, and integrity in your own relationships? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. Your story could inspire someone else to make intentional choices in love and life. If you've enjoyed following Emily and Daniel's journey, make sure to like this video, share it with friends, and subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson. Don't miss future stories that explore real love, personal growth, and the power of subtle choices shaping extraordinary lives. Remember, the strongest love is often quiet, principled, and consistent. Every choice matters, so choose intentionally.